Today, Chinese cars no longer provoke laughter or condescending smiles. The days when the phrase Chinese car was synonymous with a cheap, low-quality imitation are long gone. And it is precisely about that past of the Chinese auto industry that this video will be about. In Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, there was even a term, the first wave of Chinese cars. It referred to the early 2000s, when Chinese vehicles began to flood these markets. Most of them were far from perfect copies of European and Japanese models, and yet, despite skepticism and criticism, they managed to establish themselves. In this video, I will talk about the most notable cars of that first wave. And at the end, there will be a final boss, perhaps the most famous Chinese car of that era. A car that failed a crash test, was labeled the most dangerous car, and still managed to sell in significant numbers. Why did that happen? And why didn't the first wave of Chinese cars fail? Let's find out. The Chinese automotive industry emerged relatively recently. It was only in the mid-1950s that China began its process of motorization. Although the word motorization may sound too ambitious in this context, the priority was almost entirely given to trucks and commercial vehicles. Passenger cars were produced in very limited numbers and, of course, were not exported. Up until the mid-1990s, what we call the Chinese auto industry remained largely inward-focused and was virtually unknown outside the country. The situation began to change at the turn of the millennium. China's economy had grown significantly stronger, ambitions had expanded, and local manufacturers started to feel confident enough to step onto international markets with their own products. Tracing the history of a specific early Chinese car can be difficult, if not impossible. Chinese manufacturers shared very little information at the time, and in many cases, even identifying the exact make and model was a challenge. What we do know for certain is that the first Chinese cars were exported to countries in Africa and the Middle East. It seems the Chinese quickly noticed that Japanese pickup trucks, especially the Toyota Hilux, were in steady demand in those regions. So it was copies of early 1990s Hilux models that became one of the first serious attempts by Chinese manufacturers to enter foreign markets. There was no centralized export system back then. Shipments were handled by private entrepreneurs, some small, some larger. They would purchase batches of vehicles in China, bring them into their home countries, and sell them without any real warranty or service support. In many of those markets, local regulations allowed such schemes, and formally, they were not even illegal. As for how those first Chinese cars actually performed, their durability, lifespan, and real-world characteristics, there is very little reliable data. No one was systematically collecting that information at the time. Still, certain conclusions can be drawn. Build quality was clearly weak, and corrosion protection was virtually non-existent. But in Africa and the Middle East, that was of secondary importance. Operating conditions there were different. Panel gaps, malfunctioning power windows, or faulty turn signals were rarely deal breakers. And the hot, dry climate meant rust was far less of a concern. At the same time, it is highly likely that the engines, transmissions, and suspension components were either licensed versions or direct copies of Japanese units. That implied at least a reasonable level of mechanical reliability. But the main factor was price. Price decided everything. A brand new Chinese vehicle could cost half as much as a new Japanese equivalent, and often even less than a used original. The formula was simple: mediocre build quality, relatively reliable mechanicals, and a price lower than second-hand competitors. That is why first-wave Chinese cars sold well, and why their exports steadily expanded, both in volume and in the number of brands. Naturally, this situation did not go unnoticed by entrepreneurs in other parts of the world who also wanted to profit from Chinese cars. In the former Soviet states, real order in the business sector began to emerge only in the last decade, or even later. In the early 2000s, the picture was very different. Fully legal businesses were in the minority. Many operated either in the gray zone or completely off the books. Oversight was weak, and penalties were minimal. It was common practice to import goods from abroad and resell them domestically without paying taxes, or paying only a symbolic amount. In some cases, businesses with multi-million-dollar turnover were officially registered as small enterprises, declaring revenue of just a few $1,000s per month. At the time, this period was often described as the era of wild capitalism. Unsurprisingly, entrepreneurs from Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and several other post-Soviet countries quickly turned their attention to Chinese cars. The model was simple: buy in China, resell at home. But cars are not just another consumer product. They require local certification and must comply with technical standards. Formally, those requirements existed. In practice, however, certification procedures, testing, and inspections were often little more than a formality. And that is precisely why the first wave of Chinese imports became possible. But it would be wrong to assume that the sale of Chinese cars was completely chaotic. On the contrary, the small entrepreneurs involved in this business tried to present themselves as respectable players and often referred to themselves as official dealers. It so happened that one of the first Chinese models imported into post-Soviet markets was the same Toyota Hilux clone, sold under the name Tianye Admiral. The Admiral was a body-on-frame SUV with part-time four-wheel drive, a gasoline engine, a cheap plastic interior, and mediocre build quality. This time, however, dealers even offered a one-year warranty. The price remained attractive. But unlike in Africa and the Middle East, pickup trucks in Eastern Europe were neither popular nor prestigious. As a result, sales were modest. Not zero, but far from impressive. Still, even that modest performance showed there was potential for Chinese cars, just not in the pickup segment. Although, to be fair, both Chinese manufacturers and local dealers continued trying to push pickups in these markets for quite some time, with little success. Traditional SUVs imported under the Great Wall brand, which were essentially copies of the second-generation Toyota 4Runner, were received much more favorably. Priced at around $20,000, significantly more expensive than a Lada Niva, a Uaz, or a used Japanese SUV, yet much cheaper than a new Japanese vehicle. Great Wall offered acceptable build quality, decent mechanical components, and a reasonable level of equipment. But the real breakthrough for Chinese brands came with the import of passenger cars, not premium models, but simple, basic, and affordable sedans. In the early 2000s, the choice of new and affordable cars in the former Soviet states was, to put it mildly, limited. Sedans were traditionally preferred, hatchbacks were tolerated. Subcompacts, on the other hand, attracted very little interest. Under those conditions, it is no surprise that in Ukraine, the locally produced Daewoo Lanos dominated the market. In Russia, it was Lada, and in parts of Central Asia, it was Daewoo Nexia, a joint venture product with General Motors that, in its previous life, had been the Opel Kadett. All of these cars had one thing in common: they were cheap and extremely basic. Manual windows, no power steering, no ABS, and no airbags were considered completely normal. Which brand was the very first imported Chinese passenger car is almost impossible to determine today. At the time, car imports were handled by virtually anyone willing to try. So identifying who brought the first one and what exactly it was remains unclear. Still, it is likely that one of the earliest was a Geely hatchback, a car that very much wanted to resemble a Mercedes. Sales were weak, almost negligible. But everything changed in 2005 when Geely introduced a sedan. That was a direct hit. If you ignore the almost parody-like styling and the obvious desire to look like a Chinese Mercedes, what you were left with was a car of average build quality. As before, the mechanical components were based on Japanese designs, which meant acceptable durability and reliability. But the decisive factor was equipment. Power steering, full power accessories, air conditioning, airbags, even leather seats, all were included in the base version. And the price was comparable to, or sometimes even lower than, the bare-bones Lanos or Lada, whose entry-level trims often did not even include a radio. Judging by Geely's sales figures, for many buyers, the equipment level became the key argument. However, the new owners of this so-called Chinese Mercedes soon discovered two very unpleasant issues. But more on that in a moment. Around the same time, dozens of different Chinese brands began flooding the market. Many of them are hardly worth discussing in detail, except for the fact that visually, A large number were obvious clones. Chinese copycats probably deserve a separate video, but for now, let's talk about the final boss of the first wave. In that same year, 2005, the year the so-called Chinese Mercedes appeared, sales also began for a car that, at first glance, looked completely unremarkable. It did not stand out among the many Eastern newcomers. Yet, it was Chery Amulet that became the most successful Chinese car of the first wave. Take a closer look at it. Can you recognize which car it was based on? What about now? Yes, the Chery Amulet was built on the Spanish Seat Toledo. The Chinese purchased the production line shortly after the Toledo was discontinued. At first, they produced what was essentially the same Toledo in China under the name Chery Fullwin. The Amulet was a modernized version of the Fullwin. The Spanish, of course, had no involvement in that modernization. They simply sold the equipment. Interestingly, the Seat Toledo itself was never particularly popular in the former Soviet markets. Only a few enthusiasts could recognize its origins in the Amulet. For most buyers, it appeared to be an original Chinese design, and perhaps that played an important role in its success. For a first-wave Chinese car, not being an obvious copy was already seen as a major advantage. Ironically, Chinese manufacturers themselves did not fully grasp this at first, and continued producing cars that openly imitated other brands. The Amulet was even better equipped than the Geely. Within reasonable limits, of course, but for a budget car at the time, it had almost everything buyers could expect. Mechanically, it relied on Japanese-derived components, this time based on Mitsubishi designs. And once again, price was the decisive factor. It was positioned at the same level as the stripped-down Lanos, Lada, and Nexia. Sales started strong. The car was bought both by private owners and by taxi fleets. It almost feels as if the Amulet simply happened to be in the right place at the right time. And even the manufacturer may not have fully anticipated the scale of its success. Another curious detail: the Amulet was available in only 3 colors: black, light blue, and silver, though the silver had a rather unusual shade that could hardly be described as especially attractive. How many cars do you know that were sold in just 3 colors and still showed steadily growing sales? But things were not as bright as they might have seemed. Let me return to the 2 negative issues I mentioned earlier. The first was catastrophic corrosion resistance, or more accurately, the near total absence of it. It seems Chinese manufacturers misread the lack of rust complaints from buyers in Africa and the Middle East. Eastern Europe, however, is cold and humid, and in those conditions, first-wave Chinese cars could start rusting through in just a few years, sometimes literally developing holes in the bodywork. The second issue was passive safety. In 2007, a local automotive magazine conducted a crash test of the Chery Amulet. The result was shocking. The car scored just 1.6 points out of a possible 16. It was one of the lowest results in the entire history of those tests. Only old Ladas and a few other dinosaurs from the 1980s performed worse. And it is important to note that the Amulet was not an exception. Most Chinese cars of that era showed a similarly poor level of passive safety. One might assume that this would mark the beginning of the end for the first wave. But it did not. In that same year, 2007, Chery Amulet sales tripled, and many other Chinese models experienced growth as well. This kind of phenomenon, which at first glance seems to defy logic, is difficult to calculate. All we can do is make assumptions. My explanation for the apparent indifference to safety test results lies in the automotive culture of post-Soviet countries at that time. Passive safety was rarely a priority. In fact, even wearing a seatbelt was often considered optional. And if a passenger made a point of buckling up, it could be interpreted by the driver as a lack of trust in his driving skills. In that environment, the Amulet's crash test results truly shocked mainly those who had no intention of buying it anyway. Those who had already chosen the car likely reasoned differently. I'm buying it to drive, not to crash. It is also worth remembering that the Amulet's main competitors were not significantly safer. And in some cases, such as the Nexia, the situation with passive safety was arguably even worse. In the crisis year of 2008, sales collapsed across the board, including for Chinese brands. But by 2010, the market began to recover, and Chinese manufacturers returned to growth. During that period, they gradually moved away from the very bottom of the market and stepped up into a higher segment, the one occupied by budget Korean and some European brands. Of course, not all first-wave players survived. Dozens of little-known brands disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Geely, Chery, BYD, and a few smaller companies managed to stay afloat. They became the new face of the Chinese auto industry, no longer openly copying others, but slowly developing their own identity. Blatant imitation began to fade. Design work was increasingly handled by European specialists or Italian styling houses. Build quality improved, and passive safety levels rose. Some European brands, such as MG and Volvo, even came under Chinese ownership. At the time, there was a sense in the air that the next step would be a push into Western Europe and the United States. That has not fully happened, at least not yet. But looking at the progress Chinese automakers have made over the past 20 years, it is hard not to wonder. What will the next 20 look like?